First of all, I need to tell you I have an honest St. Olaf connection. My brother is married to a St. Olaf graduate. I have to say, I don't know what class, but I think about 86 or 87. And she said, when you go there, give them my greetings. So greetings from Nancy Ringen, supposed class of 1986. And she said, Rick, it is St. Olaf. It is not St. Olaf's. There's no apostrophe S. The other thing I need to tell you is I'm a singer, and I'm really sad not to be able to hear your choir today, and I understand a lot of them are at rehearsal right now. I love to sing. I sang at Williams College. I sang at Oxford University when I finished. And so the singing St. Olaf choir and chorus, I don't know what the formal names of it, but I did hear it just recently on Prairie Home Companion. I just loved it. So I want to take my hats off to you on that. Now, I'm here today to talk to you about a non-academic subject, although theoretically we're in an academic setting. I'm here to talk to you about your lives. I'm here to talk to you about your lives today, the lives of your parents, and your life after you graduate from this great college. Because the current economic and political situation in this country is, unfortunately, our bad legacy to you for the next 50 years. And unless you and your generation and my generation and Professor Becker's generation decide to do something about it, life is going to be hard for you over the next half century, and it's going to be particularly hard for your kids. So this is not an academic subject I'm talking about. Pay attention to that. Secondly, I've deliberately passed around a pop quiz, and not as a quiz, but as a way of beginning to stimulate our thinking about the situation today, and actually kind of get you on record saying true or false or multiple choice answers about some realities about America today. Now, there are 14 questions on the questionnaire that got handed out. Has everybody got one? Has anybody not got one? Whoa! 80 weren't enough, Tony. Can you, if you don't have one, can you sit near somebody who's got one? I'm sorry, I don't have any more. I will read the questions. There are 14 questions on the questionnaire. I'm only going to try to deal with 6 of them, okay, in this operation today. But I will read each one of them. So those of you who have them, you can do the answers on the papers that you have. If you don't have one physically, listen to what I'm saying, and do me a favor, write down your answer, because it's always easy to say, well, I knew that, if you didn't put the answer down. So put your answer down in committee. So the first question is, corporate contributions to American political candidates were first banned by Congress in the post-Watergate reforms of 1974. Everybody hear that well enough? So I want to make sure everybody can answer that. Doesn't take you long to answer that. Think about it. Question number 1. Question number 2. The Supreme Court has ruled that laws requiring disclosure of political spending in U.S. elections are unconstitutional. The court has ruled that laws requiring disclosure of political spending in U.S. elections are unconstitutional. Question, true or false? These are. Now, this is a multiple choice question. Number 3, dark money. Dark money is money we can't trace the source of in political campaigns. Dark money, not all money, just election spending by anonymous donors whose identities are legally kept secret, was just $5 million in the 2006 elections. How much dark money was spent in 2014? 50 million, I'm sorry, the question should be how much money was spent in 2012, not 2014. 50 million, 100 million, 200 million, or more than 300 million. 50, 100, 200, or more than 300. Dark money. Not all money, just money that is totally secret. Okay? Now I'm going to jump to question number 6. It's a multiple choice question. The motto of Occupy Wall Street was, we are the 99%. They were protesting against the richest 1%, because the richest 1% captures 20% of all the economic gains of the U.S. economy, 40%, 60%, or more than 80% of all the economic gains of the U.S. economy. Pick one. Next question is number 9. given the addition of 11 million jobs, actually now 12, when I wrote this question, it's a little while ago, 12 million jobs over the last 5 years, and the value of a college education, the average entry pay level for college graduates is higher, lower, or about the same as in 1999, adjusted for inflation. Higher, lower, or about the same as 1999. Last question, number 12. The American economy cannot grow fast when individual tax rates are high, so we should lower the taxes on the wealthiest people in the U.S. in order to promote economic growth because they are the job creators. Okay? Everybody done? All right, so let's do question number 1. Corporate contributions to American political candidates were first banned by Congress in the post-Watergate reforms of 1974. How many said true? Hands way up. All right, how many said false? Okay, you said true. Why did you say true? No, this gentleman here. You took a 50-50 chance, is that right? All right, well, I appreciate your being honest about it. Anybody else say true? Come on, I want a good explanation from somebody who said true. Yes, sir.
Well, it was a guess, of course, but it seems like something they would do at the time that would later be struck down by the court or gotten rid of during.
And why do you think it would be something they would do at the time? What was going on at the time? 1974, Watergate. Does that mean anything to you? Okay, really big slush fund money was discovered during the Nixon campaign, and it led to a whole bunch of political reforms and the writing of campaign finance laws in 1971, 72, and 74. So at the time was a lot going on, okay? So that's a reasonable guess. Who said false? Yes, why? You said no because you didn't think it was American law. In other words, you didn't think it had ever been done. Is that right? All right. Your answer is right, but your reason is totally wrong. Okay. So I want to have another person who said false, who actually turns out to be right, and see if we can get at the real reason. All right. I'll cut it short to save you. Corporate contributions to American political campaigns were first banned in 1907. By the Tillman Act, signed by President William Howard Taft, promoted by former President Teddy Roosevelt. In the progressive era, there was a reform movement against campaign spending by corporations. So when the Supreme Court decided in 2010 in Citizens United that it was okay for corporations to spend unlimited amounts of their treasury in political campaigns, they were overturning more than a century of law and judicial precedent. Important to understand that. Important to know the history. This thing comes out of the blue. Well, if that's the case, then we might ask the question whether or not we can go back the other way. That's just question number 1. You start to learn a little bit of history with these true and false questions. All right, let's do question number 2. So if you said false on that one, give yourself a plus. I'm checking at the end to find out if we get 6 pluses, okay? And then you're going to get enormous bonuses from Professor Becker. I've been told that, enormous bonuses. All right, number 2, Supreme Court has ruled that laws requiring disclosure of political spending in U.S. elections are unconstitutional. How many people said true? Yep, come on, get them up. Let me see them. How many said false? All right, up there, sir. Why did you say false? You. No. You. Yep.
I said false because they wouldn't preemptively make all laws called that unconstitutional. They just decided on one law, the FTC versus citizenship.
Well, you happen to be. What did you say? You said false or true?
False.
Okay. Well, you happen to be right. The one thing the Supreme Court has said consistently in its decisions on campaign finance spending is that disclosure, not spending, not limits, but disclosure is constitutional. They said it first in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo back in 1978. They reaffirmed it all the way through to the Citizens United decision of 2010. What does that tell you? Do we know? Well, I'm going to get to the next question in a minute. But do we know the sources of political money and campaign spending in Minnesota? All of them? Do we know them? Do we know them in America? No, we don't begin to. People say, well, you can't do anything about it. You have to change the Constitution. Not true. Court has not said that. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates businesses in America, has the power to require corporations to disclose their political contributions to their stockholders. Corporate boards, corporate executives are acting in the name of their stockholders, but they're not even telling their stockholders what they're doing. Okay? Federal Election Commission has the power to require the disclosure of the sources of campaign funding. It's not doing it. Why not? Because it's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and like everything in Washington, it is absolutely gridlock and won't move. But we here in the state of Minnesota, or where I used to live in Maryland, or out in California, could pass laws that require the disclosure of campaign funding. Now remember, I said this is about your life. So if you want to find out who's spending the money to elect the governor, the legislature, the senators from the state of Minnesota, or if you happen to come from Wisconsin or North Dakota or Illinois or any other place around here, you can do something about that. People can do something about that in their own state, which is what my webpage, reclaimtheamericandream.org, is all about, is telling people what they can do to begin to fix the terrible morass that we're in this country, okay? So let me go on to the next question and tell you why that's important. So the next question is, dark money was just $5 million in 2006. How much money was it in 2012? It should be 2012. How many said 50 million? No takers. How many said 100 million? Some takers. How many said 200 million? Some more takers. How many said more than 300 million? That's because you're just so cynical about dark money, right? You're just so cynical. Well, you happen to be right. We went from 5 million to 306 million in 6 years. And in the next election, it's going to be more than $500 million. The Koch brothers have already assembled a bunch of billionaires who said they're going to spend $900 million in the 2016 election. And they don't disclose who they are or where their money goes. And that is more money than either political party is going to spend. Your lives, the legislation is going to affect your environment, your student debt, your minimum wage. The healthcare system that you have is being bought by people who are invisible, operating through candidates whose connection to them you can't trace. It is going to directly affect major issues running through your entire lifetime unless we do something about it. Okay? That's why it's important. Now let me turn to economics. The motto of Occupy Wall Street was, we're the 99%, protesting against the 1% because it captured 20% of the economic gains of the economy. Who said 20%? Cynical again. 40%. Not so cynical. 60%. Okay? More than 80%. Okay. I want to tell you, when I was doing the research on this book, Who Stole the American Dream, one of the moments that stays indelibly marked in my mind is when I discovered through a professor, economics professor at Princeton named Alan Krieger, that the top 1% over the period from 1979 to 2011 got 84% of the growth in the nation's income. 84%. You know what that means? Think about it for a moment. It's not a number. 84% means that the other 99% got 16%. Quick math, 16 goes into 84 5 times. The top 1% got 5 times as much money over 32 years as the entire rest of the country. 3 million people got 5 times as much as 300 million people. Does that strike you as the way the American economy was set up to work? Is that an economy you want to go out and work in? Yeah, sure, I'm going to become one of the 1%. Okay, fine. Look around the room. I mean, not all are you going to make it in the 1%, okay? I don't want to give you some bad news. I mean, St. Olaf is doing a great job for you, but it's not all going to happen. This is an intolerable, unsustainable situation. And it's getting worse. And by the way, it has happened since the recovery. In the period since 2009, corporate profits have risen on the average of more than 20% a year. Median household income, the income of the average family, has risen 1.4% per year. Corporate profits as a percentage of national income are at the highest level in 85 years. Wages and salaries of ordinary people are at the lowest level in 65 years. It's going like this. While we're recovering, something's going wrong. We're generating jobs, and your middle class is worse off. So let's go to you guys directly, okay? Let's go to question number 12. I'll get back. Oh, wait a minute. No, let's get to question number 9. It's fine. Given the addition of jobs, the value of the average entry pay level for college graduates today is higher, about the same, or lower than in 1999. Higher. Okay? About the same. Lower. Think about it. When you look at economic graphs, they're supposed to go like this, right? You start low, it's supposed to get higher. The economy grows, and people are supposed to be better off. You all just said correctly that, in fact, you as college graduates are going into a worse job market than we had 16 years ago in 1999. Is that progress? Is that the country you want to be in? Is that the economy you want to have? Why is that happening? It's happening because we're generating more jobs, but the jobs are worse jobs. They're paying less. The income of the median family today is lower than it was back in 1999. We've generated 12 million more jobs, and people lost jobs in manufacturing factories, which paid well, which paid $20, $25 an hour, had good health benefits, had retirement benefits. Those plants, 56,000 plants in America, shut down in the decade of the 2000s. And those people are now working as greeters at Walmart at $8.50 an hour. So they got a job. Looks like a job on the books, but it's not a good job. So in America, we need a good job strategy. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But this is what you need to be thinking about the economy you're going into. And there is something we can do about it collectively. It's not hopeless. So last question. Number 12, the American economy can't grow fast when individual tax rates are high, so we should lower taxes on the wealthiest people in the U.S. in order to promote economic growth because they are the job creators. Okay, this is Economics 101. Is that what you call it here, or is it another course? Fundamentals of Economics, right? Economics 121. How many people said true? Hey, they took Economics 121. That's terrific. How many said false? Good for you. Do you know what the record is? If you go back to the 1950s, the maximum marginal tax rate, that's the individual tax rate on the money you make after you're already making $1 million. You make your next million and your next million and your next million. Under Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president, in the 1950s, the maximum tax rate was 92%. Democrats lowered it dramatically in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy lowered it to 77%. We are told today, and you hear it in the political dialogue in this country, publicly, all the time, that if we had tax rates of 77% or 92%, the economy would grind to a dead halt. There would not be any capital to invest in business. Jobs would begin to shrink. The economy would go into a spiral. Well, guess what? That did not happen during that period. That was a period of good growth in the American economy. I'm going to tell you in just a moment. If you fast forward to the 2000s, the maximum marginal tax rate was 35% under both Bush, the Republican, and Obama, the Democrat. So this is not a partisan comment, okay? The growth rate when the tax rate was 92 and 77%, the average annual growth rate over a 2-decade period in America was just over 3%. And when the tax rate was down at 35%, the average annual growth rate was just slightly under 1%. And that's before the collapse of 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no connection between the growth rate of the American economy and the level of individual taxes. Don't let any reporter, excuse me, any professor, any politician, any journalist for sure, tell you the opposite. The track record is clear. It's not only done by economists, but the Congressional Research Service did a study for the Congress itself that showed that. Now, what I'd like to do is to try to begin to bring together those disparate elements that I've tossed out to you. What's going on in our economic situation? What's going on in our politics? And have we always been like this? What kind of change has there been that's taken place? We had an economy where wealth was pretty widely shared, where we had a pretty prosperous middle class, where if you take the period at the end of World War II and you go from 1945 to the mid-70s, and you look at the growth rate of the productivity of the American workforce, which is the engine that drives a higher standard of living, it nearly doubled. It went up about 97%, at least according to some of the economists that I've studied. And the median hourly pay and benefits of the average worker went up 95%. 97, 95, dollar for dollar, the growth of the economy, the efficiency of the workforce, the profits of the big corporations were being passed through to average people. If you look at the time period from 1979, 1978 to 2010, 2011, 2012, the growth of the productivity of the American workforce was about 80%. And the growth of the median hourly pay and benefits of the average worker was 10%. 80% and 10%. So between the late 70s and today, there was an uncoupling. I call it wedge economics. There was a wedge driven between the growth of the economy, the profits of the corporations, and the pay and the living standards of the American middle class. Didn't work. The economy did not work the same way in the last 30 years as it did previously. Now understand, we're not talking about socialism, we're not talking about communism, we're talking about two periods of American capitalism. Now, what was interesting to me was trying to understand why that happened. I was trying to understand how could we have had that kind of shared prosperity in one period and not have it today. Two things matter. It's interesting. When you study history and economics and political science and so forth, it keeps coming up. Two things matter: power and ideas. Power and ideas. The idea that mattered, that made it possible for us to have that kind of shared economic prosperity back in the earlier period, was something called stakeholder capitalism. It was the idea that the job of the CEO of a major company, 3M, Minneapolis, Honeywell, you name it, Microsoft, IBM, Microsoft didn't exist back then, but IBM, DuPont, General Electric, General Motors, the job of the CEO was to balance the economic interests of all the stakeholders in the corporation. Stakeholders, very important word. By that, they meant all the groups that had a stake in the survival and success of the corporation. That meant, of course, the owners and the managers and the workers, but also meant the communities where they had factories and outlets. It meant the suppliers that made some of the parts for their equipment. It meant the banks that loaned the money, the creditors. It meant their customers. You don't want to buy a cell phone or a computer or a car or a refrigerator or anything else and have the company that made it go out of business. You can't get it serviced. You have a stake in the survival of that company. And if you go back and you read what Charlie Wilson, the CEO of General Motors, and Reg Jones, the CEO of General Electric, and Frank Adams, the CEO of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil, and William Remington, the CEO of Coca-Cola, and Irving Shapiro, the CEO of DuPont, and read what they had to say. They said it was the sacred trust of the CEO to balance those economic interests. The CEO saw himself, and it was all men at that time, saw himself as the hub at the center of a wheel with spokes going out to these various interests. They believed in it, they talked about it. And why was it important? It goes right back to Economics 121, the fundamentals of economics. It is consumption that drives growth more than anything else. Yes, you need capital. But we haven't been short of capital in the American economy for the last 5 years. American companies since 2000 have spent $3 trillion buying back their own stock because they couldn't figure out what else to invest in, and they were paying themselves in stock, so they were giving themselves a raise. And they've been sitting on $2 trillion worth of capital. Henry Ford came up with a brilliant idea, which economists now call the virtuous circle of growth. He said, I'm going to pay my workers at Ford $5 a day. I'll pay them $5 a day because if I don't, I'm going to lose them to competitors. It's fair, and if I pay them a good salary, they're going to be able to afford to buy the Model T cars that Ford Motor Company is making. And that's what Reg Jones at General Electric and Charlie Wilson at General Motors and these other CEOs said in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Pay tens of millions of American workers, middle-class workers, good pay, and they will go out and spend that money. And that robust consumer demand begins to drive the wheel of growth, the circle of growth, and push companies to expand production and build new plants and buy new equipment and hire more people. That's the secret of the long heyday of growth in America from the end of World War II to the mid or late 70s. Yes, we came out of World War II as king of the hill. The other economies in the world were destroyed, and certainly through about 1960, that was a major impact, had a major effect. From 1960 to 1980, it was what we were generating internally. And what happened was we went to a new idea, an idea called shareholder capitalism. And in that idea, which was first articulated, I believe, by Milton Friedman in a book of his called Capitalism and Freedom in 1961, and later really widely publicized in a magazine article in the New York Times Magazine, he said no. He said the only mission of the CEO is to deliver maximum return to shareholders. Maximum return to shareholders. Well, if you pick one of those stakeholder groups and say, we're going to take care of you, you're going to start neglecting the interests and suppressing the interests of the other. You're going to start cutting costs. You're going to hold wages down. You're going to cut benefits. You're going to cut retirement pay. And you're going to start moving jobs to China and Bangladesh and the rest of Asia and Eastern Europe. And that's exactly what happened. There was a disconnect between the growth of the economy. The corporations continued to grow. The national economy continued to grow. But the middle class began to stagnate over this long period. And you can actually see it on graphs. There's some very dramatic graphs. You can see the productivity curve going up like this over a 50-year period. And you can see the median hourly pay and household income figures go up like this and then begin to level off over a long period of time. And you say, well, adjusted for inflation, they were doing about the same in the middle class. Yes, adjusted for inflation is true for most things, but three big ticket items are killing the middle class. One is where you are today. The cost of higher education went through the roof. Another is healthcare, went absolutely through the roof. And the last is housing. Housing, education, healthcare grew much faster than inflation, and the middle class went deeper and deeper and deeper into debt to try to cover those costs. And that's one of the reasons why student debt is exploding today, because families can't afford it, because families weren't getting paid. So we have lost an engine of growth, and we've gotten a wedge that divides us economically. We're at two countries now, divided by money, dramatically, the 1% and the 99%, but particularly the top 5% and the bottom 95%, okay? Now, the second thing that I said mattered is power. And this comes to you, power. One of the interesting things about going back and looking in the earlier period, and I was lucky enough to be a reporter for the New York Times in the South at the time of the civil rights for United Press International, I actually saw the civil rights movement explode. It began with students, by the way. It began with student sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee, and Greensboro, North Carolina, and I happened to be in Nashville, Tennessee. And it exploded. Freedom rides. Bombings in Birmingham, Alabama. I was in Albany and Birmingham with Martin Luther King and at the March on Washington. This is a push to expand American democracy. It's a protest against injustice. But guess what? It's an expression of idealism. We can make this country better by engaging in active protest, by getting out and marching. Not by tweeting, not by talking to our friends, but by getting out and marching. Now, at the same time, there developed a women's movement. Women like Betty Friedan said, it's not fair for us to be making 41 cents on the dollar for doing the same work that men are doing. And they began to protest about that. And John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s signed the first anti-gender discrimination law in terms of women and men and their pay and unequal pay. We're still not all the way there. We're still at about 82% for women as for men, but it's a lot better than it was. There was a consumers movement. A guy named Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And what would he say? He said, Detroit is making cars that have mechanical defects that are causing accidents that are killing people. Do you know what happened last year? Do you know what happened last year? General Motors recalled 26 million cars because of mechanical defects that were causing accidents that were killing people. So we're in the same place, and there's not a murmur. There are a few people filed lawsuits. Back after Nader wrote that book, people were out demonstrating. They were going after they were going after General Motors, but they were also going after drug companies, putting out drugs. They were going after food companies. Women were going into stores and saying, wait a second, I bought this box of soap or this box of cereal last month, and the box was smaller, and it's bigger this month, but it feels like it weighs less. Why don't we get somebody to weigh it? Why don't we find out what's in it? Today, if you walk into a drugstore or a grocery store and you turn a product over on its back to see what's in it, do I want to put it in my mouth? Do I want to put it in my face? Do I want to feed it to my family? You can thank those people back then because they demonstrated and they demanded that the government fix the thing. They were not trying to hurt capitalism. They were simply saying we want a transparent transaction between the people who are producing and the people who are buying. And by the way, the same thing has got to be true with financial products, with loans. There are lots of bad loans around in all kinds of arenas. So it's a problem today. But anyway, those protests back then led to the labeling of products, the formation of the Consumer Product Safety Administration, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to inspect workplaces, the National Traffic Highway Safety. All of those, by the way, were instituted during the Republican presidency of Richard Nixon. And so was the Environmental Protection Agency. Do you know that we've just passed, what's the date today, April 29th, a week ago, April 22nd, Earth Day, right? How many people were out demonstrating on this campus about cleaning up the waters and the rivers in Minnesota? Anybody? Was anybody there? Did you guys do anything? In 1970, 20 million Americans went out in the streets, went to college campuses, went to shopping malls, went to radio and television stations to protest the fouling of America's waters and America's air. And within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act, on and on and on. I asked Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first head of the EPA, who's a friend of mine, I said, Nixon, Republican pro-business president, was he a secret greenie and we didn't know about it? He signed all this legislation? He set up the Environmental Protection Agency? He said, no, Rick, he was a practical politician. He said, they never once asked me, is it bad out there, Bill? Is it true that Cuyahoga River is bursting into flames because it's so full of chemicals? Is it true that you can get slime all over your arm if you put it in the Potomac River because of the pollution in the river, because of phosphorus and nitrogen in the river? No. He said the people demanded it. We in the government had to respond. That's how democracy is supposed to work. My point to you, and that goes for labor and the strong labor movement, and it goes for the peace movement that affected the Vietnam War, and it goes for the pressure on the government to impose high levels of taxes and to increase the minimum wage. My point to you is that middle-class political action at the grassroots had an enormous impact on government policy in one arena after another. So what's happened? We had a revolt of the bosses in the late 1970s. Corporate America got organized. There's a very interesting story behind it. I don't have time to tell it to you now. It's in my book. And if you want, in the question period, I'll get into it. But they organized. They began to move to Washington. Back in 1971, there were 175 companies that had offices in Washington. 8 years later, by 1980, there were 2,425. There were 50,000 people in business, trade associations. There were 9,000 corporate lobbyists in Washington back by 1980. Today, there are 12,000 corporate lobbyists. And guess what? There are 400 for labor, there are 200 for consumers, and there are about 200 for the environment. 12,000, 400, 200, and 187 or something like that. Totally lopsided. When people tell you government doesn't work, Think about it for a moment. I say government works. Government is working today for the people who are paying for it to work for them. They're putting all that dark money into campaigns, and they're spending $3 or $4 billion a year on lobbying. 60 times as much by business as by labor, and 100 times as much by business as for consumers. So if we want to change things, we have to do something about it. That's my final point. My final point to you is that we can devise policies to change, to do something about student debt, to change the corporate tax system, to raise the minimum wage, to do something about immigration. Washington's not going to do it. It's stuck. And the people who have a vested interest in the status quo are protecting the status quo. If you like it, more power to you. But if you don't like it, don't expect them to fix it. We've got to fix it. We have to fix it. People in this room. You are the job creators. We're the job creators. We have the power to make change in this country. We have to believe in it. What's interesting is there's more going on in this country than you believe. 28 states have higher minimum wage levels, including Minnesota, than the federal government. 16 states have said we want to roll back Citizens United and restore the power of Congress in the states to regulate campaign donations. I do not believe that is true in Minnesota. Okay? 27 states have enacted laws that allow corporations to do something other than deliver maximum return to shareholders. In issue after issue, there are things going on in the states, and there's very little attention being given to it in the media. And so there's this sense of futility and disengagement out in the country. And I'm here to stir that up. And I just want to share one last story with you about Martin Luther King. I watched him go around from city to city in the South. And in the South, where they were defending Jim Crow, racism, discrimination, they didn't like it. He'd come into Albany, Georgia, or Birmingham, Alabama, or one of those other cities, and they said, why doesn't he leave our niggers alone? Our niggers are happy. Our people are fine. They're okay. By the way, we're seeing it today on police and black relationships. Different issue, but the same kind of problem about the status quo. And our people are all right. There's no problem here. It's just out in Ferguson, Missouri. No, it's in Chicago. It's in Cleveland. It's in Baltimore. Now we've got something fundamental to deal with in this country. We've got a whole bunch of issues to deal with, and we're not dealing with them. Well, Martin Luther King would go around, the Southern segregationists would say, he's just an outside agitator. That man King, he's coming in here, and he's ruining our town. He's an outside agitator. We got to stop him. You're an outside agitator. King, you get out of here, you Reverend King. And you know what he said? It was brilliant. He said, yes, he said, I am an agitator. He said, look inside your washing machine. There's an agitator in there agitating the water and the soap, knocking the dirt out of your clothes. And he said, I'm here to agitate this country, to knock the dirt of racial discrimination out of this country. And I'm here today to say to you, to invite you, we need a new generation of agitators if we're going to reclaim the American dream. Thank you.